everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So I think we have a really interesting discussion today and a lot of really great people to chat about the first year of economic policy under the Trump administration. So I was wondering if, first of all, everyone could go down the line and introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about, what you're up to now.
So, and do you want to, maybe I'll also give my brief review of the first year. But first of all, what I want to say is thanks to everyone in this room for being here, and particularly thanks to Alexandra and Mike for being here with us to talk about the first year of economic policy coming out of this administration with a great group, including many of my budget lab colleagues. And so I'm very grateful and excited to see all of you and excited to have this conversation. My name is Natasha Sarin. I'm on the faculty here at the law school, and I also am one of the co-founders of the budget lab. And we were really interested in convening this group. We wanted to both have experience from inside of the first year of the Trump administration and have a probably, I'm guessing where Mike is going to go, a little bit of a critical lens as to what we've seen over the course of the last, now is it 12 months, almost 13 months. I will say, like, my one sentence review of what we've seen so far is I think that there have been, I think there's a reasonable policy disagreements that we'll probably bring out in the course of this conversation. I have been very struck by and frankly disheartened by some of the institutional threats that I didn't exactly predict I would see with this type of force attacks on things like central bank independence. Mike and I were talking earlier about the Internal Revenue Service and its capacity to sort of function as a tax administrator and administer the tax code in ways that have been undermined and threatened over the course of the last 12 months. And I think those sort of institutional threats go beyond policy disagreements. I think and I worry that they're going to be long lasting.
Sure. So thanks for having me. My name is Mike Faulkender. A little bit of background. I've been a finance professor for about 25 years at the University of Maryland since 2008. In the first Trump term, I was the Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy, in other words, the Chief Economist at the Treasury Department under Secretary Mnuchin. During the pandemic, I ran the Paycheck Protection Program. After that term, I stayed at Maryland, but then became Chief Economist at the America First Policy Institute, which is a think tank that very much works on kind of the America First side of the aisle. I did a lot of work in preparation for the incoming term. I was asked by Larry Kudlow in 2023 to draft an economic plan for the administration, as well as the Treasury implementation plan. I was named Deputy Secretary, so that's the #2 role, Chief Operating Officer of the department, confirmed by the Senate in March of last year. Served 2 months in addition as IRS Commissioner, and then I returned to the university late last year. And I'm back at AFPI. And let me say, anything I say today is my own personal remarks. I am neither here under the University of Maryland, under AFPI, or the administration.
So, hey everyone, my name is Mike Konczal. We have Mike distinguishment. You can just call me Konczal. I am Senior Director of Research and Policy at the Economic Security Project. Before that, I was Special Assistant to the President and Chief Economist at the National Economic Council in the last year of the Biden administration. Before that, I was at the Roosevelt Institute and did a bunch of other various things. And for my quick overview, I think last year the economy slowed down slightly across the board from the 2023-2024 baseline. Some ways benign, some ways a little bit more worrisome. We can talk about those differences. I think there was a pretty serious upward redistribution of income through the tariffs and tax bill, which I'm excited to talk about, or excited to analyze, especially with the Yale Budget Lab, who's been a pioneer of really solid empirical data on that. And then third, a different way of saying what Natasha said, I think this administration has borrowed a lot against future growth and prosperity for very questionable benefit up front, whether that's Fed independence, Doge cuts, or other things. We'll talk about that. But I think in terms of a long-term trajectory, I think we're a little worse off than we were a year and a half ago.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Mike and Natasha. I'm Alexandra Scaggs. I was most recently a reporter for the Financial Times. I'm freelance now. And before that, I was with Bloomberg covering interest rates. And before that, I was at the Wall Street Journal covering equities markets. So I have a bit of background covering markets and financial things. So I think this is a really fascinating group. And And Mike Faulkender, I actually wanted to start off with you and talk about the aims of
Sure.
policy under the administration, because it's been, there's been so much that's happened and so many policies implemented that I think maybe taking a broader view and starting with like what were the goals? And then we can drill down further in and talk about the effectiveness and other aspects.
So I'll try to keep it brief. I can definitely tell Mike and I are going to disagree on a lot. So the plan that I wrote was called Affordable Abundance. I actually wrote this in 23, so I know that there's a lot of work on the left now about abundance, but I did not plagiarize them. I have the drafts going back to then. We never
plagiarized you.
we never published it, but it was the internal document. I should say was the on the Trump transition team for Treasury. And so basically when I'll also say I first met Secretary Besson early in 2024. I thought it was going to be a half-hour introduction meeting, and 2 hours later, I was still walking him through the plan. So, and I think from that moment on, I became one of his advisors. There were 6 pillars to the plan. The first is unleash American energy dominance. Second, slash the inflationary spending. 3, return power to the people in the states through deregulation. 4, extend pro-growth tax reform. 5, sound money and sound financial institutions. 6, fair and reciprocal trade. And so we then had a division in terms of what could be done through executive action, what things required legislation, what things are subject to the filibuster versus things that could be done in a reconciliation package. And we started work, I would say, in late 23, because the Republicans had the Congress. We were able to start working with House Ways and Means to start drafting legislative language, get scores out of the Congressional Budget Office. And so again, we took as a model the way that the Democrats, when they took control of the House in the 2019-2020 timeframe, they likewise drafted what they wanted to do and got scores. And so they were able to very quickly at the beginning of the Biden administration use the reconciliation process because they had done a lot of the legwork in 19 and 20. And so we used that same model to try to have things ready to go. And we had the reconciliation bill at the president's desk by July 4th. So the challenge we have is that again, the president is a little impatient. And so some of the things we're going to take a little longer. So you cannot overnight build pipelines and build new oil extraction facilities or extend leases on federal land. Some of the energy stuff is going to take a little while longer than we would like. Likewise, on some of the trade stuff, one strategy might have been that we create some critical mineral stockpiles and generate some discussions with some of our closest partners and allies instead of going across the board. But the president thought that he had a lot of momentum at the beginning of his term and wanted to go right off the bat. And so you saw very early in the term that he did some across the board tariffs. In terms of the deregulation, I think that there's ongoing efforts to do that in the financial services space, which I was primarily responsible for. We were looking at all aspects of it. So if you think about the role of reputation risk in bank examinations, if you look at capital requirements, if you look at the fact that Congress passed a modernization of the Bank Secrecy Act in 2020, and it still hasn't been implemented, which many financial institutions will say is the most onerous form of regulation that they're confronting. How do we take dollar amounts that were set in the 1970s and update them because of the inflation that has occurred between now and 50 years ago? So there are some things that we could have done and that are in process. And then the major piece, of course, was the tax bill that I know that we will get into. A lot of it, in our view, was extending the tax package that was put in place in 2017. We're probably, it sounds like, going to argue over what the appropriate baseline is, because I look at it as if the American people think about what they paid in 2024 as approximately what they ought to pay in 2025, then the new parts of the bill were very progressive. It's no tax on tips, no tax on social security, and no tax on overtime, which all have income caps to it. So I'm a little surprised on the notion that it was a transfer upward, and that's just not at all the case if you think that the baseline is what people were paying during the Biden administration. So a lot of it got enacted. The tariffs, of course, are sucking all of the oxygen out of the room when it comes to economic messaging. I think that's part of the frustration, is that there's a lot of good work on the other pillars that are going kind of unnoticed because all of the attention, whenever the president seems to talk about economic policy, I would say that he just went to Minnesota, right? Or was it Detroit? There's the recent economic speech where it was supposed to be all about affordability, and instead it became too much about tariffs.
My question about the tariffs and also the sixth pillar, the trade relationships.
Yep.
Is the goal there, or was the goal onshoring? Was it more manufacturing in the United States? Because I think that had really puzzled people at the time of the tariff announcements, and even before, sort of what the end game was eventually with regard to trade.
So Secretary Bessent has said publicly that the tariffs serve three different purposes. Number one, they do facilitate the reshoring of manufacturing activity. So we can talk, if you want to, that we have some national security vulnerabilities as a result of certain elements that are critical inputs into the national security space, that we are reliant upon potential adversaries. Again, critical minerals and magnets being two primary examples. I would say steel being another one. So there is an argument to be made that tariff policy over the long term can potentially alter the economic incentives to locate some of that activity domestically. Second, they do provide negotiating leverage. We have seen a willingness on the part of various countries around the world to potentially negotiate over non-tariff barriers in ways that they previously hadn't as a result of the president's tariffs that he has implemented. And then third, they are a potential source of revenue. And so one of the things that I remind people all the time is the president laid out his negotiating style when he wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. And he's not going to tell you what his weighted average across those three elements is. It's not, so it may seem like one day he's focused entirely on the revenue piece, the next day he's focused entirely on the onshoring piece. Whether you call that he's not sure what his weights are, or you take my old boss's view of its strategic ambiguity, I'll allow the audience to come to their own conclusion.
I guess, because, when you talk about like having a chip in negotiations, it's the question that raises for me is sort of negotiations for what? It's is it negotiations for supply chain security? Is it negotiations for, sourcing? It just, it seems like this very broad abstract thing, but then when you look for, concrete results or things that happen.
So again, for those of us who were at places like AFPI, who were on the transition team, who were writing an economic plan, it very much was, we need to select the critical elements that are economic or national security vulnerabilities, primarily coming from potential adversaries, and prioritize those and selectively use tariffs in order to create a different set of incentives that would potentially reshore some of those activities. Now, I can understand why that it may not look like that's always what the end game has been, but for those of us that were trying to craft an economic plan, that was our goal. And I think you saw a lot of the work that was done during the Biden administration. I'd say I would like to think that the most functional committee in Congress in the 23-24 timeframe was the China Select Committee. And they did a lot of work to think about those vulnerabilities. And so we were taking some of our work from there and thinking about how do we address some of those vulnerabilities.
Can I ask that question a little bit more pointed? Because it feels to me as a policy at war with itself, right? So if the goal is to contain China, why are we trying to annex Greenland and Canada and making like really aggressive actions against allies in that effort? The goal is to balance the trade deficit. Why are we trying to get everyone to invest more? Which we can argue that in a different way, but like it doesn't seem exactly on that either. If the goal is to reshore or build up domestic capacity? Why is DOGE eliminating huge parts of the DOE? Why is it doing all this kind of war on administrative capacity that would execute that? So like, it seems like there's kind of three different things you could be doing with the tariff policy, but other things are always kind of collapsing it. And that's one reason I think there's a lot of confusion about what the ultimate end goal is.
So again, I thought the end goal was the first one. I'm happy to get into a discussion about DOGE because they actually, my interactions with DOGE is very different than what's in the media. As I think Natasha I think we're in agreement on this. The IRS started its modernization activity in 1990 and said it would take 5 years. When we came into office in 2025, they were still 5 years away from being modernized. And so having a set of IT programmers from Silicon Valley who are just going to start over and so let me get into details. So what they were doing was taking a lot of basic IRS code that's programmed in Fortran and COBOL and putting it in when they started modern language. So think like Python. Okay, now we would not do that today, but that's what they were doing. Now, what DOGE convinced me of, and again, I was acting commissioner, and for those of you that don't know, the IRS commissioner reports to the deputy secretary. So I was very involved in all of this in terms of what we were doing at the IRS. For purposes of batch processing, which is what tax filings are, Fortran and COBOL are fine. The issue is that everybody who programs in those languages are retiring and dying. And so the reason to modernize it was because because if you did need to make changes, you need to have people who know how to program it and reprogram. The critical thing that's happened in the last couple of years is AI. Because while individuals don't know how to program in that language, AI does. And so you actually don't need to reprogram all that code anymore. What you instead need to do is get all their systems to talk to each other. So as Congress would create a new tax program, what the IRS would do is create another IT silo to the point that a tax file that across all the various tax filings, they're fragmented into 18 different databases that don't talk with each other. And so we said, let's stop spending IT money on reprogramming languages that we don't need to reprogram anymore because AI solved that. Let's instead build a uniform API on top of all 18 systems that talk to each other so that when a taxpayer calls an IRS call center, the immediate thing the IRS agent no longer would have to do is put the person on hold for 10 minutes while they reconstruct the tax filing from these 18 different systems. So that's, and where did that come from? It was, people taking a whole new perspective and thinking about what modern IT architecture looks like. And also, we don't need to reinvent the wheel at the IRS because who has a lot of experience combining legacy computer systems and providing batch processing? Banks. So there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of know-how from regional and national banks that have consolidated. I remind people all the time, we've gone from 14,000 banks in this country down to 4,000, not because we've had 10,000 bank failures, but because of consolidation, and the root of that is IT consolidation. So there's a lot of experience out in private sector financial institutions that know how to get legacy systems to talk to each other that we can build upon if we take a completely different view on what that modernization looks like. And it was DOGE that convinced me of that.
So Mike, can I actually come in because I find myself nodding in it as someone who spent much of my time when I was at Treasury working with IRS colleagues. I find myself nodding in agreement with much of what you're describing, right? And the IRS's strategic plan was in fact very much based on the idea that there are a lot of insights that you can draw from the fact that the way that banking works in this country is fundamentally different and technologically assisted after the advent of the ATM relative to what it was before, right? And the IRS, when I was at the IRS, when I was around the IRS, paper returns that were being filed by taxpayers were being hand transcribed.
And still are.
And still are. That is a crazy fact in the 21st century, in the most technologically capable country, richest country in the world, that when people file their tax returns on paper, there are literal humans that are circling line items and type. That tax information to the IRS. On the other, so I'm super sympathetic with there is like a lot of capacity that can be unleashed. There's a lot of private sector expertise that exists that stands ready to provide assistance to the agency, like all the stuff. I'm also like very sympathetic, frankly, with much of what you were describing about tariffs and trade policy is like a tool that we use vis-a-vis China and national security arenas that are really important. The thing that's hard to square with those facts is like a little bit like what's happened on the ground. And maybe what you're going to say is like what's happening on the ground is kind of different from the overall policy aims. But if you think about the IRS, you know, there was a report that came out a few days ago from GovExec that said the agency has hired 2% of the people they needed to going into filing season, such that they're now moving people from across like all of the capacities that don't normally work on filing season to try and be able to answer the phones. And those people have no idea how to do what you're describing.
Right.
And so like a bit like the destruction is kind of going counter to some of the totally reasonable policy aims that I feel like you're articulating. And maybe that's by design, but maybe it's not by design.
So let me speak. So Secretary Bessent has said this in on the record, on TV interview, and so I can say the same thing. The challenge that we had with those, so again, like taking a whole new way of thinking about IT from kind of the Silicon Valley folks, that was helpful. The problem, the challenge that we had is that they were empowered from day one, whereas because of the way that the confirmation process works, the secretary was not in place for a week. The chief operating officer of the department, spent the first 2 months as a counselor. I couldn't really do much. I was not in place until March 27th, following, again, a January 20th inauguration. So it took 2 months to get the number 2 person in at Treasury, whereas the Doge people were not Senate confirmed and they were in from the get-go, and they had a direct line in the president. And as the secretary has said, the problem is that while they've got these great ideas, the Silicon Valley mentality is bend it till it breaks. And once you break it, that's what you have to reconstruct. And maybe that's fine in Silicon Valley. Maybe your platform can be down for 12 hours. I can't do that to the IRS during filing season. And obviously you can't do that to a lot of the national security agencies. And that was an ongoing source of conflict that, again, the secretary has discussed publicly, and I can agree with. And the challenge that you would run into is that even if you were fully aligned with Doge on the end state, if they felt resistance on the means of getting to the end state, they would try to say that you weren't on board with them, that you were standing in the way, that you were in opposition to them. And, there were times that I would have them say, this person's not responding to me, they need to be fired. I'm like, it's the week before April 15th. I need the chief operating officer of the IRS doing something else right now. It's okay that they are not getting back to you. That's not grounds to fire them. But it was, unfortunately, one of the challenges that you had was that I'm gonna think about how to filter myself. The time horizon for Doge and Elon Musk in particular was much shorter than others of us. And while they were set up to end, July 4th of this year, and Elon was only there for the first 130 days and kind of took this more move fast and break things mentality, for those of us who need to make sure that our bond rating is not impacted, that receipts are not hampered, that the system still functions on day 131, we were to some extent seen as creating resistance, because my objectives were broader than merely just as fast as possible getting the IT modernization done or leaning out or slimming down the workforce. And so one of the examples of it was take the data entry people. Okay, so we have 6,800 people at the IRS. When I was acting chairman or acting commissioner, we had 6,800 people that just take these paper filings and digitize them, hand code them into the system. That costs $450 million a year in salary and benefits to the American people. Okay, now the argument was made, and I think this is probably indeed true, We can outsource that for about $40 million to AI-enabled scanning. The problem was the sequence in which they wanted to do it. They wanted to lay everybody off, then go get the contract, then put it in place. And I said, what if this fails? It's like, well, we'll just hire them back. It's like, okay, there may be a spot labor market for computer programmers in Silicon Valley. For those of you that have not ever hired federal employees, which is none of you in Doge, it's a multi-month process. If I lay them off, I can't just bring them back if the contract's not in place in time. Also, I can't just go take a contract to the CEO and just have them sign it. There is a very elaborate procurement process that takes place in the federal government. So the challenge was that there was very much a view, the federal way of doing things is broken. We need to do it the Silicon Valley way. The problem is you run up against federal procurement law and federal labor law that even if you would like to do it that different way, you can't.
And that raises some questions about, first of all, this tax season, which, we're coming up, people are starting to file. And secondly, not just the sort of implementation of, again, the tax, I guess, the parts of the tax code that were made permanent, and the no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. So it raises questions about, I guess, the implementation of that. Because on one hand, it does sound like there was a lot of turnover and a lot of disruption. On the other, it does seem like this is a story that comes out every year. So 2% is a lot. That's so I do wonder, like, is this something that, if you're a person filing your taxes, is it going to be a disaster? Because we did just come off COVID. We've had a lot of really messy tax seasons lately, right? So is that going to be a big challenge? And then also, on the other hand, we should talk about the broader macro
Yeah,
implications.
I want to make sure Mike gets a chance.
Yes, I did want to talk to Mike too about that. Because
They have
there's
to
such
do,
a-
we have to get to do baseline.
Okay.
That's very important.
Yeah.
Even though it's like kind of lame, but it's very important.
Yes.
So one thing is, in 2017, the president sent the TCJA in December, and then they had all of 18 to implement it because it didn't go into effect until the beginning of 18, which meant the IRS didn't have everything really ready, didn't have to have everything ready to go until the beginning of 19 when filing season started. In this case, it was all backdated to the beginning of January of 25. It was signed in July of 25, which meant we didn't have a full year at IRS to implement. We only had 6 months. Now, anything that's just a continuation of current policy, that was actually fine. The other piece is, I guess, one of the benefits of having been both deputy secretary and commissioner. I was the secretary's deputy who was up on the Hill negotiating the tax package, but I'm also IRS commissioner. So I'm also going back to the IRS and saying, we need to start on the implementation now. So as soon as, even though the president didn't sign it until July, in April, as soon as House Ways and Means came out with draft language, I said, okay, this is not going to be final, but it is close enough to get started and we can tweak as changes get made through the legislative process. And that way we can give ourselves more like 8.5 to 9 months of prep time. And so you did see filing season opened in January, and they did get the rulemaking done. They did get the forms done. Now, where the rubber will meet the road is when the filings start coming in. So there's a lot of IT stuff that has to happen because it's not just the 18 systems at the IRS, but then it's the connection to H&R Block. It's the connection to TurboTax. It's the collection to their, the processors electronically file 93% of filings. 7% of them come in by paper, but 93% get filed electronically. All of that's got to work. I'm hopeful that there's going to be some fire drills. Like you said, every year we've got some kind of shock to filing and they will come in and try to alleviate it as quickly as possible. We're 2 weeks in and I haven't
Can I
heard
just
anything
do like
abnormal yet.
3 sentences about this? Because I actually am more worried than you, Mike, but I hope that I'm wrong. And I'm more worried for the following reason. Like, it's true, like, filing seasons are complicated and the IRS touches every single person and every single business each year. That's hard to do, especially hard when the tax code changes and the fact that policymakers spend much too little time, I think, thinking about how hard it is to implement various pieces of new law that they decide to have the IRS implement, which has to do with taxes, but also has to do with the administration of federal benefits, of which they're involved in a lot. The thing that's hard about this moment, frankly, is like we did come off of the pandemic. And when I was working in government, we had more than 30 million returns that had been filed on paper during the pandemic that were stacked up in these. I remember taking a photo in a cafeteria in Austin of all of the tax returns that hadn't been processed yet. It had been years that people hadn't seen their refunds because the IRS still hadn't been able to process them, or they actually returned the original filings to the people who had made them without a refund attached to it. And then the person was filing again because the process had been so lengthy and so convoluted. And also we had experienced a moment where, again, in response to resource constraints and the inability to be able to do the important work of tax administration, the agency was answering less than 1 out of every 5 phone calls that it received. During tax filing season, you couldn't get someone on the phone. In the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of things happened, but one of the things that happened was the IRS got this like really historic infusion of resources. And the idea about the resources was we're going to be able to do the IT modernization because, by the way, there had been plans forever, but it had never been funded. We're going to be able to hire a bunch of customer service representatives to be able to answer the phones. And we're finally going to be able to think about like actually being strategic about how we deploy data when we do audits. It's not going to be randomly, we like, throwing like darts in the dark at like partnerships to pick them for audit. It's actually going to be like through data enabled like insights, like this looks like a suspicious return. Let me pick it up and actually look into it. 100% of that work has been erased. 100% of it.
No.
And okay, so then maybe we can debate about them. Is it 100% or is it 80% or is it 50%? A lot of that work has been replaced, has been erased. And the result of that is going to be a filing season. I suspect last filing season, in some sense, as all of this was happening, the IRS has this remarkable, I'm sure you feel this way, like almost like command and control mentality, right? They're like, you give them a task and they implement against it with whatever they have. And so the last filing season, as all of the dogeness, all of the cuts, all of the mass layoffs of all of their employees were happening, it was happening alongside a filing season that for which preparations had already been made, was well in place by the time this administration took office. This filing season is not that. This filing season comes at a moment when the workforce has been very significantly hemorrhaged, when they haven't been able to hire those people to answer the phones. And frankly, and I'm sure you feel this way too, like relative to your first tour, like a lot of the senior people who were at the IRS, many of whom had like decades of experience with the agency, that was like valuable knowledge that they had about like how the tax system works. They're not there anymore. And so I have real concerns about what this filing season is going to look like for taxpayers. And I'm worried in some sense because I think it's one of those things that everyone is going to be able to tangibly feel. It's a bit like inflation. When you go to the grocery store, you see prices that are high. Like when the tax system doesn't work, like you're going to know. And I think that is going to have real consequences, not just for our revenue, but also for like how democracy works in this country.
Can I pull this in a little bit different of direction? Because I'm a little worried it's like 2025, the most important thing, tax modernization.
Yeah.
Like you got the people who obsess about it, and I'm glad they do it. But so towards the exit out in 25 going to there's not a term for it, but like, as the Biden administration was wrapping up, we're talking about things that could happen. And one thing, this tax is not my world, IRS is not my world. I'm probably going to botch this a little bit. But one thing that was floated that would be like, this is like break glass. Everything has gone terrible if this has happened. Like point of no return, like the government won't work this way anymore. Is someone from ICE will go to Treasury and the IRS and they'll ask for I-10 tax refunds. And so, okay, that's the worst case scenario. That happened in February. So like that happened essentially 6 weeks into the administration. That might not be the right way to phrase it. And maybe it actually happened in July. I'm not sure. And I don't know if it's worth going into, but there was obviously a huge differentiation in the way the White House and the civil service and the independent agencies happen. A lot of law students here, that's probably going to be determined in a few weeks through a Supreme Court case. But, the idea of Lael Brainerd calling Janet Yellen and saying, I'm going to send Mike Konczal over with his personal laptop, let him plug it into anything in the Treasury building he wants to and download the data, would have been insane. Like that just is not something that would have been on the radar, but that's kind of what happened, right? Again, you can nuance it a little bit differently. And so I think that gets to the institutional question because, you know, when Trump took office and the way he took office, like, hey, USAID gone, like that's going to happen quick. But Treasury, like, you don't become Treasury Secretary. There's, you know, the trillions of dollars, the bond ratings and all the things that were mentioned. Like, you protect your turf. Your senior people are very senior. They're very well respected by very wealthy and powerful people. And essentially within a few weeks, they just like walked in, punched everyone in the face and took everything. And it's not the most technical legal way of describing it, but the utter differentiation in the way the government works is something I don't think we have thought through yet. I don't think we know what a government looks like that operates that way. I'm hoping smart people in this room can help think about that. But a unitary executive, the loss of independent agencies, the politicization of career services, and like the, you know, they're pushing on the end game, which is Fed independence, where, you know, President Trump has made very clear he doesn't care about one or two cuts. He wants to essentially do fiscal dominance and cut interest rates to manage the debt. It's just, and he has said that in many places over many times. So I think that's not just a passing thought. I think that's very clearly the end goal there. And so that has been the most surprising thing to me, cutting $1 trillion from Medicaid. I didn't actually expect that they do that given their new political coalition, but you know, that's what they did. We'll see how that works out for them. But the actual attack on the political institutions was genuinely surprising to me. And I am still trying to wrap my head around it.
So nobody walked in with a laptop and downloaded a bunch of information. I was personally involved in the discussion and the negotiation of the MOU between the IRS and DHS. And if you look at the law under 6103, it clearly says that if there is a criminal investigation that IRS may cooperate. And so the MOU that has been made public as part of a court filing says that if somebody has overstayed a deportation order by 90 days, that is a criminal violation. Then and only then can IRS work with DHS to provide tax information for purposes of investigating that criminal action. So it is legal under 6103. We made sure that we followed that. It came to me when those requests came in. And the very first question was, have we dotted every I, crossed every T with regard to the terms of the MOU? There's these fantastical stories about the Doge guys going in and just willy-nilly downloading data. We have refuted that in court filings. I was acting commissioner. I have been fully briefed on the criminal sanctions associated with violation of 6103. And I told my staff I was not interested in a preemptive pardon. We did not violate 6103 under my watch.
Can I probe that a little, Mike? Because I think, and I imagine, but I would be curious to hear from you a little bit. It's true what you're 6103 for particular ongoing criminal investigations and what we decide, you know, given a bunch of law students in the room. And so they're very well equipped in the discussion around like the ways in which laws can be interpreted differently by different people. And so we can talk about whether or not that interpretation would be everyone's interpretation, but that's actually not my question for you on this one. It's a bit the reason why I think Mike posed this as like this was the break glass thing was unauthorized immigrants pay in something like 70. The Budget Lab did a great estimate of this fact, pay in something like $70 billion each year in tax collections to the agency. And they do that in part because there's been this, I don't know if you call it a norm or a standard or a sort of a relationship and understanding that as they do so, as they fulfill this civic duty by paying what they owe through whatever work arrangements that they're in, they will do so without concern that that information is then going to be deployed and used by organizations like ICE for the purposes of deportation proceedings. And so imagine when you were talking to the IRS about this or thinking about this, there was a fair bit of like the fact that this was a norm and understanding even had been publicly posted on the IRS's website. They like brought this up to you and said, you know, you're running some risks that you're kind of like breaking this understanding. And by doing so, there's obviously consequences for the fisc from revenue collection because people are going to try to find their way into alternative types of work arrangements so they can avoid the IRS. But it felt a little bit bigger to me than that even. It felt like it was this, we talk a lot about data security and privacy and the ways in which the government deploys data. And it just felt like we were kind of like breaking that. And I wonder if it felt that way to you or if you had any qualms about it or if that wasn't really how you were thinking about this kind of like decades long understanding.
Okay, I would say that to me, the decades-long understanding was that we enforce immigration laws and that we defend our borders. And so I would say that the break the glass moment was when the Biden administration just threw open the border. And so the Trump administration ran and got elected on addressing just the millions upon millions of undocumented illegal immigrants that came into this country and said, we're going to use all information that the federal government has. And so, again, I guess I just disagree with you guys on what the break the glass moment was.
But was there the norm? Like the norm existed, right?
The norm of defending our borders and enforcing immigration law existed, yes.
Did it though? I mean, under George W. Bush, we had an enormous housing boom that was fueled in part by undocumented labor being available and very inexpensive to construct houses, right? Like it's so funny because I feel like this has been, a very strong, liberal norm breaking administration. And I don't even think the administration would challenge that. I think they're saying, oh, this is liberal stuff, this norm. So I think it's been fascinating to see, I guess, in a good and bad way, how these things all seem to be up for debate. But it almost seemed like the norm was that immigration, as long as it was helping the economy, was okay. And then if, it becomes a hot button topic.
But I would not characterize President Trump as a George W. Bush Republican. I mean, he very clearly took the country and the party in a different direction. Now, with regard to Fed independence, I know we're probably
Yeah,
running
I
out
was
of
just gonna
time.
say, maybe we can talk a little bit and then we can
Yeah,
take one or two.
with regard
questions.
to Fed independence, Secretary Bessent put out a piece. There was a longer piece, and then he had a shorter version of it in the Wall Street Journal that I would recommend. It's called Gain of Function Monetary Policy. Has talked about how the Fed over time has expanded its set of activities and its toolkit in ways that expanded it beyond just pure monetary policy and into the fiscal and regulatory activities. And if you're going to start engaging in activity that historically have been more subject to political oversight and political intervention, then don't be surprised when you lose some of your independence. Now, I was part of the team that drafted the executive order on subjecting independent agencies to OIRA and specifically carved out the monetary policy activities of the Fed. So there is a recognition that that piece is different. I think you saw it across the ideological spectrum in the Supreme Court argument. We'll see what the decision ultimately is. But again, there was a recognition that Congress went to great lengths to protect monetary policy making activities of the Fed from political interference. And, let's see how the checks and balances of our system work with regard to making sure that the monetary policy independence is retained. But, when you start having the Fed, should the Fed be exempt from a regulatory overview when they are changing capital standards or when they're changing supervisory activities as they've been given responsibility for supervising bank holding companies? If they are going to start going to the long end of the curve, when historically it has been Treasury that decides what the maturity mix of outstanding Treasury securities is going to be. If QE is going to start being pseudo fiscal policy, shouldn't that be subject to heightened political oversight in ways that the Fed maybe hasn't traditionally been? So again, who changed norms here?
I'm so excited. In class, I promise we have to talk about the ability to disentangle the monetary policy function from all the other functions of the Fed, which I think is harder.
And in the executive order, we thought, do we go statute by statute and say this is in, this is out? And instead we kept it nebulous and said monetary policy is the jurisdiction of the Fed. Supervisory is clearly subject to oversight. And then we were kind of silent on
regulatory.
On the stuff. Well, regulatory is the supervisory stuff.
Yeah.
And then we were somewhat agnostic, we'll take it case by case on the stuff in between.
Well, I do think we want to open up for questions because we have a few minutes left. So if anyone has anything? Yes. Do you want to say your name?
Sure.
Introduce yourself?
My name is Bruce Ackerman. I teach in constitutional law. You haven't talked yet about the Supreme Court. 400 executive orders have been or issued through July. They're not the law. The Supreme Court, I mean, in the emergency docket, which was invented only 14 years ago, has allowed
I'm not a lawyer. I'm a
Absolutely. So
PhD
how-
finance professor.
Who are you to issue an executive order?
I didn't issue a single executive
Well,
order,
who
sir.
is-
I
who's the
I
person-
contributed
one
to the
second,
draft.
Who is the person who issued it? There's a person who was just selected by Trump. That's, was he, is there a secretary then we have something which is obviously, plainly unconstitutional, DOGE. DOGE is not created by Congress. This department doesn't exist. The status of it's news to me that the person who is high in the Treasury can become acting head of the IRS. That's.
I will say that happened, I will say that happened in both Republican and Democratic prior.
And remember, IRS is not
illegal.
But no, IRS is not an independent agency.
Bureau of-
IRS is a bureau of the Treasury.
I understand.
The commissioner
IRS
reports
is
to the deputy
special. I
secretary.
understand what IRS is. It is, when you say an independent agency, there are different forms of insulation. The CIA is that an independent agency? No, but it is restricted. It can't spy in the United States. And when Richard Nixon did this in the Watergate affair, he was impeached for that reason. So what we have here is the Supreme Court permitting the unilateral. There is all these challenges, and there would be more, and there will be more to these so-called executive orders, and they should be litigated before someone called a judge.
I don't disagree with you.
Of course.
Let me
But
just
the
remember,
Supreme
let me
Court,
just remind the
the
audience, though.
Supreme Court has said on 18+ occasions when a judge has decided that it's what the Trump administration is doing is illegal and that a declaratory judgment or an injunction should issue, they've suspended that without hearing the merits. This is a crucial element in the system, this non-system, without which all of these things would not have happened.
I would just say executive orders are not novel to the Trump administration. It was Barack Obama who did not want to work with the Republican Congress and said, I have a phone and I have a pen.
Yes.
And it was President Trump in 2017 signed one executive order in the first 48 hours.
Yes.
President Biden signed dozens. So let's not pick and choose. This is a bipartisan activity.
This is not a bipartisan. There's some.
You're not even going to disagree.
There are statutes.
I would,
Bipartisan.
I would
There's
like to move on.
really, this is quite
Maybe we'll just let
outrageous
one
to
of
say
the
it's
students,
bipartisan.
because
I would
We
like
do
to
have a
have
few
a student,
questions.
yeah, I would like to have a student ask a question as well. Thank you. Hi, I see someone back there. Hello. You want to introduce yourself and go ahead and
Perhaps
ask?
it's easier if I
Okay,
stand.
if anyone else wants to raise their hand, I'll see you.
So I'm a Slavic, I'm a PhD student. Actually, I wanted to talk about the modernization that you were talking about, right? So like a little bit different.
we're here
right?
for it.
Great. All three of your perspectives, because it seems like, so I have a bit of a tech background. I'm actually a technical PhD student. It seems as though what you're saying is, the Silicon Valley mentality of Doge, not compatible with government, completely agree. But it's clear that this is inevitable. So we're gonna have modernization, we're gonna have these APIs, databases talking to each other. And you talked about different departments, DHS, what have you, talking with maybe the Treasury. Do you think we're gonna get to a point where the government's gonna be too modern? Because, like checks and balances and the implementation of these like 1603 or 601, 6103 or whatever you talked about, that requires people or perhaps an AI maybe doing some sort of checking. But if you have it too efficient, too many APIs, things happening too quickly, that kind of breaks down all the checks in the system. So what's going to happen there?
Question as well, and take one more question if anyone has one, and then we can answer both one at a time.
I'm Sean, I'm at the School of Management. My question, again, would love to hear like everyone's perspectives. I think we are so focused on like what's going to happen in 6 months time horizon here. I'm really curious where each of you like realistically predict we're going to be 4 years from now, and like what's the conversation we're going to be having then, because I think there's a difference between policy that's being implemented now and then all the kind of run-on political implications that I don't know where it's going to take us, but curious for some.
Yes, do we want to start there?
Okay, I'll have to go first. Okay, I'll do my best. So on modernization, I think that first of all, I think that we are going to be in a world, I hope you are right, that we are in a world where, and I don't want to be seen, by the way, I hope in my exchange with Mike, I'm not seen as like defender of status quo the way government works right now, or worked, a year ago, because I think there were like a lot of things about the ways in which the IRS had attempted to modernize over decades that highlighted for me all the ways in which the government is in fact broken. Like, so if you think about the fact that it takes people months on months, years even to get in the building once they're hired by the agency, or the fact that the IRS is unable to create a simple indexing system so you can look up a single taxpayer and pull their history of returns. That technology doesn't currently exist at the agency. And I hope you are right that modernization is coming and they are going to be able to do that. But to Mike's point a little bit about why the Silicon Valley mentality is maybe a little less compatible than one would hope with like the way government works. The challenge in government is you kind of have to build the new plane while you fly the plane, right? They can't just like shut down the IRS for a filing season and like build a better one. They actually have to continue to be able to do the hard work of like running a filing season at the same time as they do the work of modernizing. And I think making that sort of bringing in insights from the outside, bringing in a lot of technological expertise, but bringing it to bear in a way that allows us to still function day to day is like a super hard thing to do. And it becomes, by the way, I hope you are also right that the appropriate thought is given, and a bit that's some of the conversation that the three of us were having, the appropriate thought is given to the ways in which like the IRS already experiences 40 billion cyber attacks a year. Right. So giving more access to more contractors, even if you do so in like the most careful MOU, all the structures, exposes them to more kinds of risks. And so I hope that the thought is given to like how to do this in the most safe way, and how to, as we're thinking about AI more generally, the ways in which you need to have the appropriate types of structures in place to like make sure that you're having a human supervisory role in a way that makes sense as all of these technologies continue to function and dominate various aspects of our lives, like is especially important in government, but not uniquely important in government. And I hope that all of that is done. And I guess that is a bit, I think 28, I mean, every election, I feel like we say, this election is the most consequential election of our lifetimes and all this stuff. And I think that what is really interesting about the next couple of years and related to the important work that I hope my colleagues and I at Budget Lab are doing is you are going to have a very robust and important conversation about policy across a host of dimensions. The next president is going to inherit a Social Security trust fund that is going to be extinguished in their tenure. They are going to inherit a situation where our deficit problems are getting, we didn't get to baselines, but regardless of what baseline you decide to choose for how you do your particular analysis, the reality is you have to pay for the stuff that you do. And so our deficit problem has gotten worse, not better, and will continue to get worse over the course of the coming years for reasons related to our demographic challenges. We're gonna have complicated questions around what labor markets look like, both maybe because AI is coming for a lot of jobs in different sectors, but also because we're aging. And so like the result, and we're doing less immigration in this country than we predicted we were gonna be doing a couple years ago. And so we have less prime age workers than we were going to, or thought we were going to just recently. And all of those are gonna come to a head in important economic policy conversations that I think like are going to require a lot of thought on both sides of the aisle about how to navigate and hopefully useful work from groups like us at Budget Lab about how to analyze the efficacy of different types of approaches.
Let me jump in and then you can figure this out. So on the checks and balances, I think right now the main check and balance is Congress and the executive. And right now, powers that we would expect, and even specific actions where we'd expect Congress to step up and defend things that are priorities, even Republicans like USAID, like items, we're not seeing that. And, there's a lot of fighting in the background about whether or not this certain funding is being reappropriated that had been cut, and a lot of technicals, but just, it seems like there's been a kind of a power grab from the executive, from Congress to the executive. And Congress isn't defending its turf right now. I think there's political coalition reasons for that with President Trump and his power over the base, but we'll see what that looks like in a few years. But so that's where I think about checks right now. Obviously, at the API, at the stack level, et cetera, et cetera. But like, if you don't have that check, a lot of other things aren't going to matter as much, I think, or at least that's a different answer than perhaps what you were asking. How's the next 4 years go? Who knows, right? But a few things I'd say, if I was advising the administration, I'd say there's a couple downside risks that they should be aware of. One is just like voters are mad about housing, food, and healthcare. And food and healthcare are going to take some pretty big cuts over the next 2 to 3 years. And I think in a way that people will feel. I think on housing, obviously the tariffs are not great for the housing markets. The tax, other things on the Fed as well as are downside risk on mortgage rates, but the 50-year mortgage going after the large asset, like a lot of that stuff strikes me as very gimmicky and not at the heart of the problem and not even in a positive way. So I'd say try to address something around these core issues for your voters rather than cuts that are like bringing down the tax rate for Amazon or whatever they're doing. On AI, I think there's big downside risks for labor market. I can feel Martha Gimbel yelling through the camera that we didn't talk about AI, and I apologize. But I think it's very hard to see the impact of AI on the labor market right now. Maybe a little bit in the productivity numbers. It's a huge question mark. But if there were like first real software layoffs related to AI this year, that wouldn't surprise me. And so like, how do we deal with that kind of transition risk? I don't think anyone has really great answers, but I'd really encourage the administration to try to think through that because I think it's going to be really important. The labor force, like steady state job number might be negative this year or next year. The population is going to shrink in wave of mass deportations. And, I think we have not dealt with an economy like that. And I genuinely don't know how that impacts things. I think it'll be like just a shock to think that this might be the largest the labor market's ever going to be in the United States. We'll find out. But I think that's a huge risk. And then, if you were to ask me, criminal indictments of central bank members who disagree with you, I think is bad on, efficiency and equity grounds. I think that's a very bad policy. And this institute, whether it's all the cuts to scientific research, whether or not it's dismantling parts of the government, whether or not it's a tax on the central bank, these things, Yale Budget Lab has had great papers about essentially government risk, a risk premium related to poor governance. I forget the exact term they use for it. You can jump in if you have it. But I think they're borrowing a lot against the future. And if I was part of the Trump administration, say, ease off just a few of these things, and you can get the things you want, your MAGA priorities, without risking real destabilization of our institutions.
Might the government have too much information and too efficient? I do worry about that. I have a kind of more libertarian streak in me. And so I like the fact that right now to get financial information about an American citizen, you're supposed to have a warrant rather than having all of that information centrally. It's one of the reasons I'm opposed to a central bank digital currency is because I don't want more transactions running on government platforms so that they don't have to have warrants. One of the reasons I want to increase the dollar amount at which banks file suspicious activity reports and CTRs is so that the government doesn't know what I am doing with my own wealth and my own money. So I'm of the view that if you have government doing less, then there's less ability for them to use information in nefarious means against their own citizens. So I do worry about that. I think I agree with Natasha on the thing 4 years from now. When I was assistant secretary, the first week I was there, we were putting out the financial report of the US government. Prior to that edition of it, the executive summary read section 1, where are we at? Section 2, where are we going? We modified it and it's been the same ever since then. It now reads section 1, where are we at? Section 2, an unsustainable fiscal path. And all the spending we did during COVID just accelerated that. I testified in front of the Senate Budget Committee a couple of years ago, and a senator asked me whether the question was, by the end of the 10-year budget horizon that the Biden administration had submitted to Congress, we were going to have like a $45 trillion total amount of debt outstanding. And the question was, can we have that amount of debt? And I said, Senator, I don't know, and I don't want to find out. I have said to a number of audiences, I worry about what is the day when financial markets coalesce around the idea that the only way to solve our budget problems is to print money. And I do think to some extent that the reason, I say to people, if you want to address housing affordability and bring down mortgage rates, you need to get the fiscal situation under control, because right now markets are charging a premium. Why are inflation expectations elevated? Because there's concern that we're going to print our way out of the budget problems that we have right now. And so, but the problem is if you go to your marginal voter and say, the way for us to bring down mortgage rates is to do something about fixing Social Security and bringing down Medicare spending. Because again, I know people like to talk about other things, but when the baby boomers fully retire, Social Security is 6% of GDP and Medicare plus Medicaid is 7%. So you can't deal with our long-term fiscal situation if you're not going to talk about those big programs. But the political equilibrium right now is that both parties lie to you about the extent to which they need to be addressed. Because there's an old joke in Washington where we have all these multi-lettered agencies in Washington. What are the 4 most feared letters in Washington? AARP. Right. And so there's been this unwillingness. I do wonder, as millennials start being a larger portion of the electorate, are they going to come to the conclusion that the baby boomers have robbed them blind and finally force us to deal with the unsustainable nature of our budget situation that Secretary Mnuchin and I put on paper with his signature back in 2019.
It's really fascinating stuff. And I like that this conversation sounded really in the weeds, but it really ended up being about state capacity, which I think is just a fascinating subject in general. And there's been some really interesting scholarship years ago about the state's ability to tax and then its relationship to the broader buy-in from the society, or in terms of support for the government. So I think, it may sound a little niche, but I do think it really gets down to the nuts and bolts of what we're all doing here and what we're all interested in. So thank you so much, Mike and Mike. And I am blanking, even though I know your name very well, Natasha. I was like, Natasha, horribly embarrassing. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And this was a really fascinating chat. So thank you so much.
And thank you.